Pleasure to be here with Davidar. Welcome, sir, to the Kolkata Literature Festival. You're you're part of two panels today. The first one is about discussing Indian fiction, where it stands, the past, present, and the future. Before I move into fiction, I have a larger question about the publishing industry. Where does it stand a couple of years into the pandemic? There have been a lot of premature obituaries written about the book, about the printed book at least. Where do you think Indian publishing stands right now?
Well, Indian publishing was battered during the pandemic, and I presume you're talking about publishing for the general reader, not textbook publishing or academic publishing, because that is what I know about, and that's what I'm qualified to talk about. So I think all major publishers and minor publishers, obviously, got really badly battered by the pandemic in terms of sales, in terms of how to keep going. Fortunately, I think most of us have survived, and I think we have recovered quite nicely. This is our recovery phase, and if there aren't any further great traumas, I think we'll be fine.
What do you make of the book in its original form? I mean, nowadays, of course, a lot of people are reading on Kindle, a lot of people are actually consuming books through audiobooks as well. Where does the book in its original quintessential form stand, especially for a casual Indian reader?
Well, as you said before we started the formal interview, you said there have been many obituaries that have written about the book, the printed book, because don't forget it's a technology that's several centuries old. All of them have proved to be premature, because India ebook sales are minimal. They're less than 20%. But even in countries where they have been really strong, such as the United States or Korea, today actually printed books are outselling ebooks, so they've plateaued everywhere. And I think the reason is quite simple. It's because no matter how good the ebook is, no matter how good the kind of technology is in terms of delivering the book to the reader in digital form, it somehow can't match the experience of reading a book in physical form, in terms of every book feels different. The look of type on the page is different from the look of type on the screen, and also maybe there's just a sort of romantic attachment to the book, but printed books are not going anywhere soon.
In terms of the genres that are doing particularly well in terms of fiction right now, what would you identify as the genres that are gaining traction, and are you seeing any particular languages, regional languages doing very well in terms of Indian publishing right now?
Well, I think fiction in India there are some parts of the country, for example, I was in Kerala recently, and I don't know about Bengal, it might be true of Bengal as well. There, literary fiction does really, really well. In the rest of the country, it does really poorly, because for me, the two major developments in recent times have been, one, the interest that Indian readers finally have in literature and translation. Otherwise, unfortunately, we had what was commonly known as cultural cringe. Anything that was made in the West is better than homegrown stuff. And I had to battle that for many, many, many decades in my career. Once upon a time, the bestseller lists were dominated by books published outside. Today, they're dominated by books published at home. So the Indian reader has finally got out of his basic insecurity to read books written by us, if you want to put it that way. However, I think where fiction is concerned, it goes through, it has peaks and troughs because it depends on how good the fiction is. At some point, by coincidence, you have a number of giants who are writing astonishing books. Other times, they're not as good. So that is understandable. But like I said, the first big development which is good is books in translation are getting acceptance. And two, big non-fiction is getting acceptance. We are really poor at writing non-fiction. For the longest time, our non-fiction sucked. Now it's getting to be really quite good. And people are embracing it, whether it's history, whether it's biography, whether it's sort of current events, etc. So those are the two things that are happening today that were not the case, say, 15, 20 years ago.
In terms of fiction categories, what do you make of where the novel stands today? Because increasingly we're seeing the rise of microfiction. There are lots of authors taking up short stories as well. But do you feel that the novel is anyway endangered, or is it just one of those phases where perhaps it isn't at the acme of its popularity?
I think the latter. I think, like I said earlier, unless there is a really strong novel, there is a really heartbreaking novel, there's a really exceptional novel, why would you read it? There's so much choice that you have, and there's so little time. Why would you pick up a sort of thing just because it's a novel? So I think that's the answer to your question. I don't think the novel is going anywhere, because I think the great novel cannot be supplanted or replaced. But there has to be a great novel in order for readers to read it.
Quickly segueing to the second session that you'll be part of, where you'll be talking about a new history of India, which is the new book brought out by Mr. Rudrankshu Mukherjee. How important is it in today's India to have such a sweeping version of history, such a sweeping perspective of Indian history? And where do you see this book in the larger gamut of Indian literature that talks about Indian history?
Well, I think one can't overemphasize the importance of such a book, because it hasn't been done before. If it was easy to do, you would have a dozen books in competition, but there aren't any. If you took a kind of survey of books of Indian history for the general reader, written in one volume, you will not find a single book that covers the span that this book does. And the answer is quite easy. You have to be a historian of extraordinary breadth of knowledge in order to be able to know what to leave out, because that is the key to books like this. If you wanted to write a history of India, you could write 1,000,000 books and still not cover an inch of the true history of India. But to provide an introduction to the history of our very old, very great, very complex country, you need to have someone who knows enough about history, geography, economics, politics, etc., to know which are the salient points that have to be covered and which has to be left out. So this is a masterpiece in that regard. Where does it stand in the pantheon? Very high, because in the last 50 years, there's not been more than half a dozen genuine attempts to write histories of India by proper historians. And I'm not disregarding attempts made by journalists and novelists even to write history, because why not? If you know enough, you should be able to write a decent book of history. But just like a scientist is trained in his discipline, a historian is trained in his or her discipline. So Rudrangsha has the advantage of being trained, and his co-authors have their own strengths. So essentially, this book is not going to be repeated easily. I'd be very surprised if your grandchildren sort of saw another book of this ambition. So it's going to be read for many generations, and it's especially important in our time when you have regimes that are responsible for generating fake histories, for attempting to suppress history, for trying to pervert history. It's really important to have something which is an objective, well conceived, well received, and well written history, and that's what a new history of India is all about.
My final question is, which part of the book, or which perhaps era, or which particular aspect of the book has stood out to you, or have you found the most compelling or most surprising?
Well, let's put it this way. When you're covering several billion years of history, I think the genius of the book is to pick out every single significant sort of era, epoch, personality in our country. Tomorrow, if a Martian came to this tent and said, "Tell me about your country," I'd give that Martian a new history of India.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, sir, for your time.